Everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the LLSC this afternoon. We will be starting the webcast in about 2 minutes. And for those of you just joining, we will get started in about 1 minute here. Welcome to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada's webcast, Life After Acute Myeloid Leukemia, Personal Stories of Hope. In this webcast, we will be hearing real stories from 3 AML leukemia panelists about hope, healing, and recovery. Our panel speakers will each share their story of diagnosis, treatment, and recovery, and provide personal insight into managing a blood cancer diagnosis. This session is offered as part of today's Western Canada Blood Cancer Conference. If this is your first session with us, welcome. And if you've been with us all afternoon, welcome back. All of our sessions have been recorded, so if you'd like to receive the recording of any of our previous sessions from today, I encourage you to please reach out to myself or to Caroline Mitchell, Community Services Manager for the BC region. Let me introduce myself. My name is Desiree Naylor, and I am the Community Services Manager for the Prairies region here at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada. I will be the host and moderator of this online event. This presentation will last approximately 60 minutes and will include a question and answer period at the end. Since there are many of you, we invite you to type your questions and comments in the question box of your Zoom webinar panel throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring the questions throughout. I will read some of your questions aloud at the end of the presentation during the question and answer period. Again, this conference will be recorded, therefore you'll be able to listen to it again. Before we begin our main presentation, I would like to share with you our mission and highlight some resources that you might be interested in learning more about or might be helpful for you or someone you know. At the LLSC, our mission is to cure blood cancers and improve the quality of life for those touched by blood cancer and their families. We offer guidance and support every step of the way. We know the current situation presents many challenges to those affected by a blood cancer and their family. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society's Community Services Managers can help. As compassionate connectors, we are here to help those affected by a blood cancer cope with anxiety and isolation during these times. Please do not hesitate to reach out. We offer a variety of educational resources and support services to those affected by blood cancer, including AML. For example, on our website, bloodcancers.ca, you can access free booklets and fact sheets containing information about specific blood cancers, treatments, and practical information, as well as a new AML educational video. Also on our website, you can watch recordings of all of our past webcasts and view announcements of upcoming webcasts. You can also subscribe and listen to our podcast series, The Blood Cancer Experience, to learn more about treatment and research and to hear stories from people affected by blood cancer. Available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and anywhere you enjoy listening to your favorite podcasts. Our peer support program is a support service that matches people affected by blood cancer, caregivers, and their families with trained volunteers who've been touched firsthand by a blood cancer and shared similar experiences. Whenever possible, participants and volunteers are matched based on their age, gender, and diagnosis. It can be a useful program these days to counter the effects of isolation. In these difficult times, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada is here for you. You may be alone in your home, but you are not alone in facing blood cancer during a pandemic. Being part of a community can help us to feel less alone by reminding us that we're not the only ones facing these struggles. I am so honored to be hosting this session. We have invited 3 panelists to share their blood cancer experience with us today. And again, while we've prepared a few questions to ask them, we encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A box that we can ask them at the end of this session. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today, Mike, Libby, and Amy. Welcome. I'm going to take myself off of screen share so we can see all of you. Perfect. So we've prepared some questions, but we kind of want to get to know a little bit about you. Mike, I'm going to start with you. Can you share a little bit more about your blood cancer experience?
Absolutely. Well, Desiree, thank you very much for being here. And to all of you I can't see, so glad to be joining you this afternoon. My name is Michael Wark. I'm joining you from Red Deer, Alberta. And I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with blood cancer. So it was almost 3 years to date, actually. It was June the 21st, 2018, when my life changed in a very rapid way. I was 27 years old. I was 5 years married to the love of my life, my best friend and wife, Lorraine. I was launching into my career. I had recently completed my journeyman carpenter certification and was getting ready to kind of ramp things up with moving forward with my career in construction management. And Lorraine and I had just started thinking about planning a family of our own. And I was away a couple weeks before on a retreat with some friends. We were out doing some mountain biking in the backcountry, and I had some trouble figuring out why I was having some trouble keeping up with my friends on the trail. I was feeling tired. I was just really fatigued. It wasn't normal for me. I was used to kind of leading the pack, so to say. And so, I mean, just like any other guy, I just kind of dismissed it. I figured, oh, maybe I didn't get enough sleep the night before or something like that. But the symptoms didn't go away. And a couple weeks later, I picked up a bit of a bad cold. I couldn't shake it. I got this strange swelling in my gums. I had the fatigue. I was waking up with night sweats, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And after about 10 days of this, my wife Lorraine convinced me to go get checked out in the emergency room in Red Deer, and I was admitted right away. And that was when things really kind of started to change. I recall being in the emergency room, and they brought in internal medicine specialists to come check me out. And I remember him saying, "Oh, your spleen is a bit enlarged. That's an early warning sign of leukemia." And Lauren and I were like, "Whoa, what's he talking about? That's leukemia. That's cancer, right?" And we learned very fast that yes, indeed, it was cancer. Things moved very fast after that point. I spent 2 more days at the Red Deer Regional Hospital while they conducted a battery of tests, and following a bone marrow biopsy, it was pronounced to me on June the 21st, almost 3 years ago to a date, that I had AML. And in a sense, I was very lucky at the time. When it was caught, my doctors told me that it was anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks old at the time that they found it. But at that time, it had already compromised my immune system and taken over about 80 to 85% of my bone marrow. So I had no functioning immune system. I was very weak. It explained why I'd been feeling so tired, because I had no blood counts to speak of, no hemoglobin, no platelets, no white blood cells. I was immediately put in an ambulance and sent down the highway to Calgary, where I began assessments for getting ready to be treated at the Tom Baker Cancer Center in Calgary. So later on that week, I began a course of high-intensity chemotherapy, induction chemo, which lasted for 5 weeks. And during that time, we began exploring options for how to defeat this thing. At that time, we had very little information. We didn't know a whole lot, except that AML was a very rare blood cancer in young adult patients in particular, and also a very aggressive form of acute leukemia. So it was the highest priority of my medical team to make sure I received immediate treatments. Things moved very fast, very intense. During those first 5 weeks as an inpatient for me, my life literally turned upside down. I went from a healthy 27-year-old to lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to an IV line, fighting for my life. It was a very moving experience, to be sure. To sum up the rest of my treatment from there on, I was very blessed, very lucky to have a wonderful, excellent support network close by. I received top-notch medical care from the healthcare professionals at Foothills, and also got tied in with resources in the surrounding community like LLSC. I was very fortunate to find the First Connections program, which hooked me up with a fellow survivor who was there to provide encouragement and advice and support throughout the 7 months I was in treatments. Following my 5 months of initial induction chemotherapy, I got some good news at that point that 83%, 80 to 85, somewhere around there, I ballpark at 83, the leukemic cells in my bone marrow had been reduced down to 0.2%. So I was able to achieve initial remission after the first round of chemo, but we didn't get it all. And so the option became then, okay, what do we do to get rid of the rest and make sure that it doesn't come back? So for those of you who are following along on my timeline, that places me in August of 2018. At that point, we began exploring options for an allergenic stem cell transplant, which would have offered me the best chance for a full cure for getting rid of the remaining leukemic cells in my bone marrow and making sure it didn't come back. My sister was first tested for a match, but like 3 out of 4 Canadians, unfortunately, a family match was not an option within my family. So instead, we turned to the International Stem Cell Database to search for a genetic match donor who could have come from anywhere across the world. And I was very fortunate. In my case, a genetically matched donor was found in about 3 weeks, and they agreed to come on board to donate their stem cells via a peripheral stem cell donation, which took place on October the 24th, 2018. So in the meantime, I went through a couple more rounds of consolidation chemotherapy in order to keep me in remission. And in October, I received an allergenic stem cell transplant. The process of going through a transplant was both exciting and anticlimactic in a sense. I could speak at large about that, but it was very similar to the process of a blood transfusion. But an incredible experience actually within that, to be holding a bag of cells that I knew had the power to save my life. And so following the stem cell transplant, I went through an additional period of 100 days of observation. I was in for regular checkups while I was an outpatient, but was going in a couple times a week to make sure that I was healthy and the cells were doing their thing and embedded. And in January of 2019, following a final bone marrow biopsy, I was pronounced to be in full remission and 100% cancer-free. It was a very momentous day that I will never forget. That was almost 2.5 years ago. I have been in full remission since that time. I remained on a medical leave for an additional 10 months following January of 2019 before I was able to return to work once again. And it's been a long process since that. I've learned many things. I've had the great fortune to get involved with the young adult survivor community here within Canada, which provides comprehensive support, largely, I would say, on the mental health fronts to young adult cancer patients and survivors between the ages of 18 and 40. And I've actually had the opportunity to do a lot of advocacy work and volunteer work with a number of different organizations, including Young Adult Cancer Canada, the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, Wellspring Calgary, and of course, the Leukemia Canadian Blood Services. Sorry, I said LLSC already. So that's a little bit about my story. There's a lot more I could tell you, and I hope to get into that within the questions, but thanks very much for giving me the mic, Desiree. I look forward to chatting a bit more.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for joining us today. Amy, I'm going to keep it in Alberta for a moment, and I'd love to have you share your blood cancer experience with us.
Sounds good. Thanks, Desiree, and thanks everyone for having me here today. So it was interesting actually hearing Mike talk, because a lot of things were very similar across mine. So mine began, I was in post-secondary, so I'm actually 18 years now since diagnosis. But very similar. I was your young, active, athletic person and just fatigued. So I remember coming home from post-secondary for the weekend to go visit my mom and just carrying even just my weekend bag. I was wiped. Like I felt like I just ran 10K, but I probably walked 100 meters. And I was like, huh, what the heck? Like maybe I have mono is what I was originally thinking. Because my roommate in post-secondary had mono, my friend. So I was like, oh, that must be it. I must have mono. So I remember driving back up to Calgary and just having a hard time even focusing and concentrating. Probably shouldn't have drove back, but remember being like, ugh, not just wiped. So when I got back, I asked my sister to take me to the doctor, and just went to a family doctor, and they ran blood work on me. And then when that came back, they went in and they sent us straight to emergency. So I ended up going straight to Tom Baker, where they ran a bunch of tests on me there for the day. And then my oncologist actually was the one that came in, and she said to me, Amy, you either got hepatitis A, leukemia, or some infection. And for some reason I knew I had leukemia. So I looked at my sister and I said, that's what I have. So I got admitted to the hospital that night. And then same thing, they did bone marrow test just to confirm my diagnosis. And then I went straight into treatment. So same thing, it was like hitting that brick wall. Like one moment I was a post-secondary student writing my finals. Next thing you know, I'm sitting in a hospital bed for a summer. So yeah, it's kind of like hitting that brick wall. In terms of my treatment, I feel like it all went fairly quick. So it was about a month that I was in the hospital. I had a couple of different types of chemo. I had a drip, I had some injections, and then I had some chemo pills. I did lose all my hair, I have to say. It actually wasn't that bad. Bald head massages are beautiful. They feel really nice. You just got to be careful with the sun, especially when you're pasty white like I am. But yeah, overall, I have to say my treatment was pretty amazing. My doctors, when I first got admitted, there were some new drugs that were available, but I didn't end up being part of the study because it was going to take me longer to get onto the study, and they wanted to start me right away. But after about a month being in the hospital, I got back to, I'll call the normal existence. Like I went straight back to post-secondary. I was stubborn. I wasn't going to let it disrupt my life. So I went back to school wearing a beanie to cover my bald head. I was still on chemo pills. So there were some days I just felt nauseous and I didn't feel good at all. Like I remember being at school, like booking it as fast as I could because I was gonna be sick. And I remember thinking like, oh, they probably are like, what's wrong with her? But I guess ultimately they probably just was thinking I was someone who spent maybe the night out at the bar the night before. So it was maybe a little bit easier when you're in post-secondary, and that's kind of normal behavior for your early 20s. So for me, yeah, I was very fortunate. They did test my sisters in case I did need a transplant. Both my sisters were matches. So I know that's really odd. So I joked with the sisters. I said to them, rock, paper, scissors, ladies, who's going to be up if I need you? But luckily I didn't need that. And then from there, I just had regular bone marrows to check and make sure I was good. And it was, I don't even remember now, but I think about a couple of years, I was still on medication. I was still on pills. I felt like an old lady because I had so many pills. I couldn't remember some days if I'd taken them or not. And as a young person, I thought, oh man, I should be able to remember. So I remember like laughing, being like, okay, I'm going to be like that 80-year-old that needs like the bubble pack or like the pill case to keep track of all my medication to make sure I actually took them all. But I was fortunate in that it was a fairly normal existence from that point. It's easy enough to take a couple pills and go on with your day.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amy, for sharing. And again, thank you for being with us today. I love how virtual events allow us to bring together panelists from multiple provinces. So Libby, welcome from BC. Can you share with us your blood cancer experience? Libby, you're on mute, sorry. You're on mute.
There we go. Okay. Good afternoon. As you know, my name is Libby and I am speaking to you from Vancouver, and I'm clearly the senior citizen of this group of panelists. I was in my 40s when I was diagnosed with AML, and that was almost exactly 14 years ago in June. Again, seems to be the month for us, Michael. Anyway, by sharing a bit of my story, I hope, and the stories of Amy and Mike, I really hope that we're able to offer some much needed reassurance and hope for those of you who are newly diagnosed or are in treatment or who are coping with survivorship, because that can be quite a process as well. So for me, back in 2007, just 3 weeks after I started having these really odd neck spasms and increasingly severe headaches and just like back pain, I was just totally stunned to be diagnosed with AML. And as you two have mentioned, it's an aggressive form of blood cancer that for most of us requires our immediate hospitalization. And the best description I've come up with for this is like the feeling of being transported into this parallel universe, but it's a terrifying parallel universe, and it's isolating. And, it's like you go, as Amy was saying, one moment, in my case, I was a competent professional, a mom, a spouse, a friend, and the next moment you're lying in a bed and you're a blood cancer patient, and it's terrifying. And so I was in hospital isolation for most of the next 4 months, with a couple of weeks of break amid that time, but I really didn't get out until, as I recall, Halloween that year. And I was terrified of dying. I was fortunate that chemotherapy put my leukemia in remission, but I was told there was a 60% chance it would come back. And about 10 months later, my leukemia returned. At that point, I needed a stem cell transplant. I don't have any siblings, so that wasn't an option. But I was very fortunate that they located what was deemed a perfect match for me in the donor registry. I now have a relationship with a young man, his now wife and 2 children from Israel. There you go. We met many years later. So I did end up having a stem cell transplant in November of 2008, and needless to say, it worked. So for me, looking back over the last 14 years now, I remember the physical and the emotional trauma associated with facing a life-threatening illness. But there's no question that what was most difficult for me was the possibility that I might die and leave my then young 11-year-old son motherless. This was my primary concern. From my hospital bed, I would write little love notes for my little boy. And my husband, makes me emotional now, all these years later, and my husband would put these notes in his school lunch bag and also on his pillow at night to help lessen the impact of my prolonged absences. As I think many of you know, some days during treatment and between treatments were very difficult to tolerate. And I relied on a variety of influences to help calm me and engender hope, like get well cards on my hospital bed and photos of people that I loved, healing imagery, meditation, and of course, very special people in my life. You know, those people who can be with you when you're so fragile you can barely be with yourself, who can hold hope for you when you're feeling hopeless. Those are very special supports. And I just also want to comment that, suddenly being in remission, at least for me, maybe not for others, but suddenly being a survivor isn't free of complexity. It can still be a challenge. And now, after 12 years of being a survivor, I really view it as, as a growth, right? It moves with time and it gets easier as the days go by. Unlike Amy, who was raring to go back to back to university, I was so afraid initially that leukemia would come back that it took over my life. I could barely consider the future. It was almost like I was superstitious as an early survivor, that if I viewed myself as being alive in the future, then for sure the leukemia would come back. I found it hard to leave my home, partly because I was afraid of germs, but also because I had no hair, no eyebrows. I was very bloated because of corticosteroid medication. And I realized in retrospect that I kind of lost my identity temporarily. So I really wasn't sure who I was in this world as a new survivor. So, for those of you who are feeling at odds like that, I don't think it's that abnormal, and it's okay, and give it some time, because time is a real healer in that sense. For me, as time goes on or went on, the intensity of my fears started to diminish. And there were longer and longer periods of time where I could focus on other things, not just cancer. So, having had leukemia will always be part of the scenery of my life, but it's no longer the entire backdrop. So I think I'll stop there.
That was lovely. Thank you so much, Libby. Thank you for being with us today and sharing your blood cancer experience. I've prepared a few questions for each of you individually and then some kind of group questions. But I do want to remind those that are joining us today, feel free to put any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A box down below. Mike, I'm going to keep kind of going back in that circle. So I'm going to start back with you for the questions. When you were first diagnosed, what would you have said would have been the most useful thing to have known at that time?
Desiree, I don't think I could sum it up to just one thing. And I'm really glad you pitched me this question, because I could probably go on for a long time about all of the different lessons which I've learned going through treatments, and now with the hindsight of being able to look back on it after 2.5 years. And personally, I find the chance to be able to perhaps impart some of that experience to those of you who are currently going through that to be a tremendous privilege. So let me see if I can share a few things. The first thing that I think I would like to say is that when you're first diagnosed with any sort of cancer and you find yourself as an inpatient, all of a sudden you're in a strange environment, you're dealing with tests, procedures, you're hooked up to an IV line, you can't leave, you're afraid of people coming in and out because of a compromised immune system, things like that. It's completely overwhelming. And in my case, and I'd like to make the assumption that Libby and Amy would both agree with me on this. Your brain enters what I would think as a survival mode, and everything else just kind of stops. And you just kind of focus on it. It's like an unconscious, subconscious impulse, on what you need to do to get through it. And it can be very overwhelming in a sense. And you don't actually have time to process a lot of what you're really going through, at least on the mental front, until in some cases months, even years later. And so with that, I think one of the big lessons which I learned out of those early days of going through treatments was the need to be gentle with yourself, the need for self-compassion. Prior to my cancer diagnosis, I got to a point where, I was constantly pushing myself in my productivity. I was always an A+ student going through school. I did tons of extracurriculars. When I got into my career, I was very productivity oriented. I think in many cases, it became something of a downfall of mine where I would, I would almost judge my self-worth based on my output. And I think that's an easy trap for many of us to fall into. And then all of a sudden you're faced with something like a cancer diagnosis, and a lot of your independence is taken away. You can no longer work in many cases. You can't do a lot of the same activities you used to be able to. You're dependent upon other people for your very basic survival needs, and it can be very overwhelming. It can be really hard, especially for those of us like myself who are so productivity oriented. On our ego, it's a huge hit. And so out of that, I think, drawing back on that lesson that, all of a sudden you face this crazy, massive, life-altering change, but yet there's a part of your mind which still expects you to carry on like everything's normal. Let me just say, it is not normal. And you need to be gentle with yourself. It's gonna take time. A very wise friend of mine in the cancer community told me when I was new to survivorship that it takes considerably longer to heal from the mental scars of going through cancer than it does the physical scars. And so with that, I think I would say, don't expect everything to go back to normal right away. It will take time. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of hard work and a lot of self-motivation, but finding a sense of comprehensive healing after what you've gone through and finding a sense of peace with it, being able to reconcile with the fact that your life has changed, perhaps irreversibly, is very possible. It will take work, but you got to be gentle on yourself. You have to take the time your body needs to recover, because like Amy had said, I too just wanted to jump back into things and get going. My doctors actually, well, I don't think they could stop me from doing so, but they strongly advised me, take the time you need on your recovery before you get back to work. I wanted to go back right away. But working on construction sites, there's debris in the air and all sorts of stuff. And I would have been very prone to respiratory infections, and that would have just been a bad idea. And so as hard as it was, I did take time, but I needed it, and I'm very, very grateful for it. It wasn't easy at the time, but I'm so glad that I did take that time now, because I needed it, both physically and mentally, really just comprehensively speaking, to recover. Couple more points I'd like to touch on that question. Finding out, especially in those early days, how to navigate the healthcare system and actually receive support is a really big one, and something that I wish people had told me more about, or I'd actually listened to properly when I was an inpatient. I'm talking about things like finding access to financial supports, finding access to psychosocial services and mental health resources within your cancer center, getting involved with survivor networks. In my case, fellow blood cancer survivors, or programs like the First Connections program. All things which help you feel a little less isolated and a little more supported while you're going through the toughest time in your life. With that, even simple tips like bringing a journal with you, or putting your phone on record when you're sitting in doctor's appointments so you can remember all the things that are being said, recording important information so it doesn't go through one ear and out the other when you got chemo brain. Tips like that, super important. Listening to your nurses when they tell you about insider information on the units. I learned when I was in treatment, there was actually a secret menu at Foothills, and you could get, on order milkshakes if you wanted. So things like that, even just, finding your way around a massive, medical complex like Foothills, and how to get from one place to another for tests. It can be a bit difficult in those early stages. So taking the time to, figure that stuff out, very, very important. I learned the value of self-advocacy when it came to my healthcare team, and standing up for what I needed, not just going off what the opinion of one doctor or healthcare professional might have said, despite the fact I had some very, very good ones. That's incredibly important. And the final thing I'd like to touch on with that question: don't Google your cancer. Just don't do it. It's not going to put you in a good space. I made that mistake in the early days. I started looking up survival rates, tried wrapping my head around things like, what does it mean to be a 5-year survivor of AML? It sent me on a bad downward spiral for a couple of weeks. Google is not always your friend. It's like comparing apples to oranges, apples to airplanes, really, for that matter. honestly, the best person to give you medical advice in your specific case is your healthcare team, not what some Yahoo on the internet says about your cancer, because it's not a fair comparison. And in my particular case, there were a couple of weeks when I actually felt very anxious and very depressed because I'd been Googling too much and was concerned that this thing was going to kill me. So that would be my biggest advice. The internet is not always your friends. Take the time to look after yourself, have self-compassion, to be gentle on yourself, get access to resources, and learn how to navigate the healthcare system. Those are the biggest things I really wish I had learned in those early days. That would have been very helpful to me when I was first diagnosed.
Thanks, Mike. That's all great advice, right from, right from diagnosis, right to kind of survivorship. So really appreciate that. Amy, what do you think the biggest challenge was for you when you received your diagnosis, and how did you manage that challenge?
I think the biggest challenge was just life as you know it coming to an abrupt halt. Like I said, I was just finishing off my finals at school and ready to go into another semester, and all of a sudden it's, oh, how do I change everything? Like, I got to cancel all my courses. I was living in an apartment. Now I was going to be living in a hospital. So all the logistical side that came along with it, when I like that word, when you have chemo brain. So that's where I think it kind of built into how did I deal with it, and really it was my supports. So my family and my friends were huge. They took over literally everything for me. So I was very lucky that way. I just had to focus on my treatment and getting through it. But yeah, it's definitely, it's like you hit a brick wall, right? And one day you're Amy, the post-secondary student, and then the next day you're Amy, the blood cancer patient.
Absolutely. And I like how you touched on the supports that you had. I think that's going to be a reoccurring theme that comes up. Libby, when your doctor was determining how to treat your AML, what was that process like for you?
Right. Well, you're going to start hearing some of the same issues again. Really, I think the early days when you find yourself in hospital isolation and they're making all these determinations about exactly what brand of AML do you have, let's put it that way, and how are we going to best treat it. Those were some of the most stressful days of my entire life, bar none. And, there's different ways of describing this. I felt like I had entered a foreign land, but I didn't speak the language. So information can be, given to you, but it's quite overwhelming. And, there was a protocol to be followed. I didn't have to make any decisions about how my illness was going to be treated. It was just a matter of hanging in there while it happened. But it was really trying. I would describe myself as being in psychological disarray for quite a long time, harking back to what Michael was saying. I couldn't, for example, I never mind Google. Well, you know what? We didn't even have Wi-Fi in the hospital back then. That's how long ago this was. But if I had access to Google, I couldn't read. I couldn't even listen to the radio, and I certainly wouldn't speak on the telephone, except to my child at night. That was different. So, I was really struggling just to calm my spirit and my mind. That's where I was at for quite a long time. I do want to tell you guys about one personal encounter I had during that period. Really changed the game for me. And one evening I was visited by a hematologist that I had not met before. And this woman, physician, came into my room, introduced herself, but did so by kneeling down so that she was at my eye level. And then she took my hand and she looked at me in the eye and she said, Libby, I want you to have hope that you can beat this disease. Can you imagine? It was like this angel had read the need for reassurance in my eyes, and she gave me what I needed. Up until then, it had been a series of concerns about informed consent and a lot of statistical probabilities, which were never in my favor. And there was this person who was willing to say, have some hope here. And it was a real game changer for me, because I think while we can't hold hope all the time, maybe some people can, I certainly couldn't. To be able to hit hope once in a while during this process is pretty vital. So that's my answer.
That's still lovely. Like, I think just having somebody talk to you on your level is so important when you're going through something like this. Mike, coming back to you, and again, we've talked about the support systems in our life. What would you say was kind of the most important thing that your loved ones did for you during your cancer experience that just made it so much easier?
Great question, Desiree. The first thing which really comes to mind for me was just simply being there, not trying to come up with the answers, not judging me for what I was going through, because I think I placed all this self-judgment on myself already going through the experience, and going from being a young, capable, independent guy to all of a sudden hospital bedridden. Just really being there. And the biggest person I think I have to thank for that is, of course, my wife, Lorraine. She immediately put her job on hold and moved with me down to Calgary for the next 7 months while I was going through treatment at Tom Baker. We were very fortunate to have my mother living very close by the hospital. She only lived about 5 blocks away. So when I was outpatient and for the whole time that I was in treatment, Lorraine would be staying with her. And every single day I was in treatment. When I was inpatient, that was 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. Lorraine would be there with me and help me kill the time. We'd play a lot of card games. We'd explore hidden parts of the hospital. We'd, watch lots of Grey's Anatomy, do whatever we could to try and kill the time. But just having that companionship was the biggest thing. And I recognize, especially in this COVID era, it's gotten extremely more difficult for current patients to go through. I've heard many stories of patients having to be basically on their own while they're inpatient. And my heart just goes out to you so much for having to go through that experience like that, because I think in my particular case, the biggest thing which made going through, especially those days as an inpatient hooked up to chemo, that much easier was not having to do it alone. Besides that, I can't say enough for the home cooked meals that family and friends would bring, because God knows we all get sick of eating instant noodles and canned Campbell's mushroom soup when you're in the hospital and all the other gross stuff they feed you. So having the chance for that was a big thing. Then, of course, like I touched on, having a place to stay when we were there with my mom, who lived very close by, was a huge help. And also the financial support that our friends and family were able to kick in to help with the out-of-town living costs for us having had to relocate for my cancer treatment played a really big role. I had some friends who put together a GoFundMe, which really helped. I think those would probably be the biggest things I think that really help to make it a lot easier. But the biggest one I just really want to touch on, of course, is having people not try to understand the situation, but just simply to be there to walk with me through it, to know that I wasn't alone going through the experience. I was very open from the very beginning with what I was going through. I think I started a blog on my second week going through cancer treatments. At first, it kind of just became a way to get the news out there to everybody who was concerned, because I had friends all over the world who wanted to know what was going on. And then after that, it actually became very therapeutic for me as well, to be able to write about the experience. But with that, and I could spend a fair bit of time talking about cancer and disclosure as well, came a lot of different things with that as well. For example, now that I've been so open and public with my story, it's out there for anybody to see and anybody to do whatever they want with that. And so that sort of came with the territory with that. And so I'm very thankful to my friends and my family for accepting the experience of me going through what I did with AML for what it was, for not trying to come up with the answers, because let's face it, I'm sure we've all heard a lot of different quack theories about, eating too much kale or things like that, or things you can do to not professional medical advice for curing cancer. I'm thankful to my friends and family for not trying to force those things on me, but just simply for being there. That would be the biggest thing I would have to say. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Do you still write on your blog?
I do not as often so much anymore. The last year or so, I've gotten into a bit more public writing. I've done some advocacy work for you guys and for Canadian Blood Services as well. So a bit more public stuff with that. Like Libby was saying, having established a relationship with her stem cell donor, I've actually had the same opportunity, which has been an incredible blessing. This past fall, actually on my 30th birthday, I received contact information from my donor, who is a young woman in Germany, and we've since gone on to build a virtual friendship, as it is. And so I've written extensively about that. It's been really, really cool. We actually played some online board games together with our families last weekend, and yeah, so that's been quite the incredible experience, and to be able to share that experience about what that's been like, and really the whole experience for me going through treatments has been quite incredible. And then to be able to go back and look on it now, several years later, and realize what we went through, it was difficult at the time, but I'm glad that I did it. I'm glad that I have that record of, despite what was one of the toughest times of my life, to be able to pass on that experience to others and also have it to look back on myself is a very rewarding thing.
Lovely, thank you. Amy, how did you adjust or transition back to that new normal? Whether it was kind of after your diagnosis or after treatment happened, like you can choose whichever kind of time frame you wanted to, but how did you go back to that new normal?
Yeah, it is definitely a new normal, I'd say, for sure. In the beginning, that's probably a really good word for it, versus being normal. Like I mentioned, I, being stubborn, went straight back to post-secondary. So yeah, it was a little bit different, right? I had like peach fuzz on my head. I didn't have a whole head of hair. I wasn't going out as much, right, with my friends. I was still recovering and probably needing more sleep behind it. So it did take time. For sure. And also behind that, like I was still going, I don't remember how frequently in the beginning, back to see my specialist and for bone marrow tests. So it was, I'd say, probably a good kind of 2 or 3 years for me to be quote unquote normal behind it. I was quite young when I was diagnosed. So I think that was a bit of a blessing behind it. When you're an early 20-something, you think you're invincible. So I think if I were diagnosed now, and especially me having kids, like when I was hearing Libby's story, I'd be a lot different. But as a 20-year-old, you're like, okay, what do I got to do? When are we going to get through it? And let's move on. So it's, yeah, like Michael said, it's kind of just being patient and with yourself and knowing you're not exactly where you were before, but you'll get there.
Absolutely. Libby, this is the last of the directed questions. How has your life changed now that you have had cancer, and have you gained anything from your experience?
Oh, yes, my life has changed, and I have gained a lot from the experience of having cancer. I think Michael has already touched on some of these things. I don't think I understand all the ways in which the experience of AML has impacted me, but there are some things I know for sure. And one of them is, for example, that I am much better able to focus on the present than worry about an uncertain future, which I was very, very good at before cancer, or ruminate about a difficult past. So I'm, I just have a greater appreciation for life and its pleasures, even the simple ones. I know that sounds like a cliche, and I'm not there every moment of the day, but I'm sure there a lot more of the time than I was before the experience of having AML. Um, the other thing I just want to mention is I have also learned to be much kinder to myself when old worries reemerge. So even all these years later, in response to a triggering event, like an unexpected phone call from a doctor, why are they calling me? Or a physical symptom that I don't recognize or is going on for too long. I can suddenly worry that after all this time, the leukemia has come back. But what I'm able to do now that I certainly would never have been able to do before is I'm able to approach myself with empathy and say, you know, you were once traumatized by an unexpected diagnosis of a serious life-threatening illness. Of course you're reacting like this. And it just helps calm me, and then I'm able to regain my emotions. So I really do think nobody would choose to have cancer, nobody that I know anyway, but there can be, even in the darkest of clouds, there are silver linings. And so I would say that I'm having probably an easier life and more meaningful life in some ways than I might otherwise have had.
That's lovely. Thank you. I really appreciate all of your candid answers or given the questions that we threw at you. We want to talk a little bit more about maybe what the most important supports were to you during your time, and maybe how your community played a role in your treatment and recovery. So it's not directed at anyone specifically. Whoever wants to pop in, feel free to answer away.
I'll jump in. So for me, my biggest supports were my friends, my family. I don't know if my mom ever left. I think she pretty much just slept at the hospital every day. So I couldn't have done it without her. And then for me, see, now I just get teared up. I'm how many years in, I still do. But yeah, in terms of community, for me too, it would have been my soccer community. Like I played a lot. And so just being able to be with my soccer friends again and eventually start to play made all the difference.
Yeah, I can jump on that one too. I think maybe this is one that isn't touched on so much, but something that really played a big role for me in going through my cancer experience was the role of my faith and spirituality. I was very close to my church community in Red Deer prior to getting diagnosed, and had a lot of people praying over me during that time, and even just sending notes saying hey, we're really thinking of you. You got this. We're sending up prayers. It really made a big difference to my mental health, I would say, and just helped me hold on to a greater sense of positivity that no matter what happened, I was going to be okay getting through this. And so, out of what was one of the most difficult experiences of my life, I'm very grateful to say that my own sense, I think, of faith and spirituality is in fact stronger now, having been through this experience, than it was before. It gave it a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. It's taken a lot of time for me to figure out how exactly that all comes about. And I think, like Libby had said, when it comes to silver linings, even in the darkest clouds, to be able to gain a sense of, I don't know if there's any sort of logical reason for why this happened, because I don't know if you can justify the logic behind cancer, but to be able to pull some good out of the experience. In my case, being able to advocate on behalf of fellow survivors and patients, to be able to share stories of positivity and hope in the midst of what can otherwise be a very dark and trying time. And just to be able to give back, that has provided a lot of meaning to my life nowadays. and a greater sense of identity to be able to say, you know, to my cancer, you didn't claim me, you didn't beat me, you're not my identity, I am so much more than just a blood cancer diagnosis. That's huge for me. And so I think having a chance to give back, to get involved, and of course, my connection to my faith and spirituality have been really the biggest supports besides that of my friends and family that helped me get through this experience.
I love it. Yeah, Libby, go ahead. If you want
Well,
to add.
I mean, you know, I'd almost just be repeating what Amy and Mike have said, but, you know, I'll give you a couple of examples. I, for example, had a friend who moved into my home a month at a time to help take care of my young son. I mean, how do you even measure that, right? Or the kindness of those in the community that I barely knew, or certainly, you know, I knew to say hi to in the hallway of the school, that kind of thing. I mean, there was a steady stream of meals being delivered to our home, so that even though I was in the hospital, and my poor husband was, you know, trying to deal with a child and me, and you can just imagine, well, you both know, I mean, many of you know, there was at least a hot meal or a meal that could be easily heated up. So it's there are so many different ways that we are supported when we're going through this process, and they're different, but they're all vital in their own way.
Perfect. We have had a couple questions come in our Q&A box. So again, anyone that's listening in, feel free to type your questions in there. One of the questions was, I am an AML survivor as well. What does telling your story feel like? I've written my story, but I think I would still be too emotional to tell it out loud in person.
Yeah, I can touch on that one. I think it's a very personal decision, I will say. When you put it out there, especially in a public forum, telling your story, it's something you really have to kind of weigh. Because I think about, you know, like I had mentioned before, there are many different things that go into that maybe you don't even really realize when you're putting it out there to begin with. You know, for example, and this is by no means, you know, I certainly hope not to detract you from considering putting your story out there. But, you know, in my particular case, I went through a period in my survivorship where I was job hunting. And I was a bit concerned that, okay, maybe my employer is going to go back and read my blog and they're going to realize I was off work for a long time. They're going to ask about holes in my resume. And then how do I explain that? And things like that. Thankfully, that never caused any issues for me in finding employment once again. But the thought definitely crossed my mind. But overall, I would say it's been an immensely rewarding experience. And I'm really, really glad that I had the chance to share my story, and especially the positive outcomes which have come through it. But not only just that, but the whole nitty-gritties of the blood cancer experience, the good, the bad, the ugly, so that people can come to understand. One of the things I've come to realize is that unless you have actually been through the experience of hearing those 3 terrible words, you have cancer, and then knowing what it's like to be hospitalized, to be hooked up to a central line or IV, you know, everything which goes into treatment, as much as our friends and family and supporters can try, they can't fully understand the experience. And so they need your help to understand it. They need you to be able to explain what it's like to be able to go through it so that they can better support you and they can understand. In addition to that, I will say on a personal level, for me, getting involved with the survivor community of other people who do know what it's like to go through that experience and share that genuine empathy is a really, really big thing. But you know, to you who asked that question, I would say as a whole, the experience of sharing my story has been immensely rewarding, and I'm very thankful to have had the chance to do so. I've received some feedback on it. You know, I've had people who have said, you know, I went through the exact same experience, or thank you for sharing. I thought I was all alone in this, and now I know that I'm not. Receiving that feedback has made it all worth it for me. And so I have no regrets over that.
I mean, I can add to that. I don't think I ever had any intention of sharing my story. And it all started quite a few years ago now when I was asked to be an honored hero for the Light the Night walk, which required me to, get up on outside at Stanley Park here in Vancouver in front of all kinds of people and give a short version of my story. And that's how it started. And the response was really positive. And I remember my son, who was a young teenager, was just thrilled that I had done that. And I think that was like, oh, this maybe is important, And so it's led to quite a range of speaking opportunities over the years, including fundraisers for the stem cell registry from where I received my donor. So I've spoken in different cities, which has been quite exciting for me. So, I would just say to the person who's asking the question, if you have a notion to give it a try, give it a try. I've cried during speeches, by the way, or when I've been speaking, and people don't mind. It just shows that you're human and that you've been through something. I'm not surprised, Amy, that you felt tearful when you were thinking about. It makes me tearful when I think back to how people were there for me, because it shows the goodness and kindness in people. So, if you feel comfortable, give it a try. And if it's not your thing, you don't have to do it again. That's what I would say.
And I'll maybe just quickly touch on that, why I do it. So I'm part of the committee for the Light the Night too. And I think it's just so huge to share your story. I've gone through and I've done presentations to different corporate offices to try to get corporate teams involved. So really on the fundraising part, and you're always surprised. You go into this room and there's always one that either they've had some in their family, them themselves, they've done it, and it's then just getting that awareness and more money to go towards research and more cures, right? So that we can end blood cancers.
Absolutely. This question's come up kind of in different formats, but how long did it take post-treatment for you to feel healthy and normal again, that new normal?
I'll step in. I think for me, to be as quote unquote normal, I'd say it was a good couple of years, right? I think it takes time to kind of process everything. And in the beginning too, you're just trying to figure out how to get back to normal. And then it takes a while to kind of realize you can do all the things that you used to do before. But yeah, it does take time. So for me, I'd say it was probably a good couple of years. And two, I was on medication for a while, right? So I don't think it's till I was completely off meds and not going for any bone marrow tests to feel like I was 100% back.
Yeah, I would echo that too. I think, well, first off, I think that's a very open-ended question, because the first question which comes to my mind in response to that question is, what is normal exactly? Especially in the era of COVID now as well, throw it in on top of the cancer diagnosis. And I think we're all struggling with that question about what is normal. To see if I can break it down a little bit on a physical level, I think following the end of treatment for me, which would have been 100 days following my stem cell transplants, I started regaining my strength fairly rapidly. I started going back to the gym about a month after I got out of treatments. I had lost a fair bit of weight to chemo, about 20 to 25 pounds, I think. And so I focused very heavily on trying to put that muscle mass back on that I'd lost. I was trying to consume as many calories as I could. I think it was aiming for 25 or 3,000 calories a day, just to try to regain the weight I'd lost once again. And I think I was going back to a gym probably 5 or 6 days a week, I think. And that played a very big role in helping me get back, physically speaking, such that I think by about I want to say maybe month 8 or 9 out of treatments, I was more or less, not 100%, but at least 90% back to my old physical baseline. Now that varies person to person. It depends a lot on, what you were like prior to cancer, what you might have been affected with going through your treatments. It's completely different for anybody. It wouldn't be fair for me to say, well, I was able to recover to my old baseline in this timeline, so you should do the same. It certainly doesn't work that way. But that was my experience. I worked very hard to try to stay in good physical shape since then. I get out for regular bike rides. I'm quite active in sports. I love snowboarding in the winter, mountain biking in the summer, and I really credit a lot of that physical exercise and staying active even in treatments to a healthy physical recovery. Somebody touched on diet before. Yeah, big time. Also cut a lot of processed foods and white sugars out of our diet to it wasn't directly related to cancer, but I don't want it coming back, and so I want to do everything I can to try to stay on that. Mentally speaking, yeah, it takes some time, at least a couple years. I would say it's probably still an ongoing thing. There are some aspects of going through cancer that will probably be with me for the rest of my life. Thankfully, I've been able to reconcile with a lot of them, but it's an ongoing process. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, I feel that I should add that, I think people should understand, or it might be helpful for them to understand that for many of us, there is no going back to normal. And it's really about being open to accepting and eventually celebrating a new normal. That is certainly my story. I have some physical, long-lasting now, and they are not going to change at this point. I have a wonky immune system. I'm still on immunosuppressant medication, not a lot, but I'm on some. And I do have some mobility issues. These are not the kind that prevent me from walking, but I certainly can't run. There are things that I can't do. I never was able to resume my aerobics classes, for example, but I love my Pilates. So, I think that it's none of this has meant that my life is less fulfilling. In fact, I would argue over time, as I've mentioned before, that I think I've learned to have a new value to life itself that I might not have otherwise. So it's okay, right? I was forced to create a new normal. I don't work full time. I was never able to go back to working full time. But you know what? I work just enough to keep myself intellectually stimulated, and that's just fine. So, there are asking this question about when can I expect to be back to normal. I would recommend looking at celebrating that which you can do now, I guess would be my response to that.
Well said, Libby. I would echo that.
I think we're going to wrap up the questions. I just had one more, though, that I'm going to throw at the three of you. There's going to be many people listening to this recording and that have joined us today as well. What message would you give to someone that may be going through treatment or struggling with their AML diagnosis?
Okay, I'll start. If I can only give one piece of information or advice, it would be something that I wished I had known about when I was going through the early stages, which I didn't. I would recommend the First Connection program or the peer support program of LLS. It offers short-term support for people who are currently in treatment. And, when you're speaking to someone who has survived the path that you now find yourself on, there is nothing quite like that. There is this level of understanding and a feeling of validation that you can't get any other way, and it tells you that you're not alone. I speak from personal experience. At a time in my cancer journey when I was just feeling so hopeless, I learned about the First Connection program, and I spoke to this individual who had survived what I was now facing. And it changed my life, because just the fact that there was one other human being in the entire world who walked the path and survived made me realize that it was possible. And you know, it's nice to have, as I've said, some hope. There was hope for me that I could survive despite the odds being against me. And so that's the program I would recommend.
Yes, my answer is much the same as Libby's. Two big points, takeaways, as you said, Libby, are the knowledge that in going through this, what may very well be the toughest experience of your life thus far, you are not alone. There are many, many other people out there who know what it's like to go through the same experience. And so I would encourage you to reach out and get connected to, you know, your fellow blood cancer survivors. I've had the privilege of being able to be involved with many different groups where we regularly meet and discuss many of the issues which go along with the cancer diagnosis, and then into the later stages of survivorship as well. You know, I host a group every 2 weeks. There are many people out there who do so, you know, either through things like the First Connections program or elsewhere as well, that provide resources, free resources for survivors. Because in many cases, yeah, nobody really gets what it's like to go through this experience unless you've been through it prior. And so the knowledge that you are not alone going through this, and there are other people who get it, who you can always talk to about the experience. And for us, you know, for those of us who have taken the step to go out and be public in our story of going through this, you know, I can't speak for Libby or Amy, but for me, myself, I always consider it a privilege to be able to speak with someone who feels the need for support in that knowledge to help reassure those going through this that they're not alone in this. And the second big point, of course, that Libby touched on is there's always hope for a brighter tomorrow. Even in what seems like the darkest days that you're going through, you know, knowing that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that this is a temporary period and it won't last and there are better days ahead, that knowledge just does absolute wonders to help get you through those dark days. And so hold on to that hope wherever you can find it, because it's what's going to get you through it.
And then I'll just add a little. So yeah, I second Libby and Michael, and yeah, it's lean on the others. That's what they're there for. That's why they're offering. Don't do it all alone. And I think the other big thing, if you can't, have a sense of humor through it. There's days that you probably won't be able to, but the days you can laugh, I think there's something to be said about just having a good belly laugh.
That is fantastic. I'm just gonna pull my slides back up. Libby, Mike, and Amy, I want to thank you guys all again for being a part of this panelist session. I also would like to thank Astellas for making this webcast possible. And sorry, I just want to remind everyone that we are here to help. Do not hesitate to contact the LLSC if you need more information or any resources or support. You can reach us by email at info@bloodcancers.ca. Also, make sure to check out our website regularly to watch all of our past webcasts or for any of the upcoming webcast dates. Please note that a short survey will be sent out to all participants after this webcast, and we would greatly appreciate you taking a moment to fill it out to help us make sure that we're providing the right resources and that, you know, what else you would find valuable for the near future. And just a reminder that each experience is different and unique, but hopefully you are able to take away some information from our panelists today. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your Saturday, and stay safe.